Thanks, Roger, and thanks for having me for the TASA Thursday lunchtime sessions. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of this stuff that I've been doing with a lot of people. I can see a lot of colleagues and friends in the room, which is really nice. So thanks for rocking up. I'll share my screen and we'll get cracking. Maybe Roger or Sally, you could just give me a thumbs up to let me know that screen is visible. Yep. Fabulous. Thank you. So like Roger said, my name is Tristan Kennedy. I'm from the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, and I'm going to share a bit of, I guess, the research, the outputs or the findings from some research that I've started last year in 2020. About 12 months ago, I started the data collection aspects of this project, looking at Indigenous people's experiences of harmful content, hate speech, negativity, and that sort of thing on social media. And first up, I'd like to acknowledge the Darug Nation, the Wadamadagal people, on whose lands Macquarie University is built and operates today. And I also acknowledge the Kaurna Nation, on whose land I'm sitting on right here in Adelaide. I was born on Kaurna country. My background actually is Noongar on my father's side, but yeah, this is where I was born and a community I'm part of here in South Australia. I also acknowledge that this particular research was funded by a grant from Facebook in 2020. So, in the interest of transparency, you can keep that in mind. I'm happy for questions through the session if you have anything you think is pressing as we go through, but I expect we'll probably have quite a bit of time at the end to discuss as well. So, it's up to you how you want to approach that. A little bit of background about this research. Essentially, it comes from this recognition that there's a kind of need, quite urgent need, to understand the changing nature of negativity and harmful and hate speech on social media. That is, through developments of technology, digital technology in particular, the ways that we navigate, the ways that we identify negative content really changes quite frequently because of that changing nature of technology. And this was not just us or myself understanding it, my colleagues in our department, understanding that there's a need to look at this. Not even just that Facebook had an interest in looking at this, but as lots of Indigenous scholars suggest, and certainly it's a tenet that I adhere to, that as Indigenous researchers, we really do have a responsibility, a non-negotiable responsibility to community, to conduct research that's important for community and for Indigenous peoples around the country and the world. And in that sense, it's something that's recognised by community as needing significant attention. So that's sort of the motivations behind the project. Bronwyn will be happy to know I'm going to mention my methods in one dot point only and then move straight on. The participants were from New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, and the US. It was specifically targeted at Australian Indigenous people's experience of social media, negativity, harmful speech, and that sort of thing. Given the connections that I've got and the department has through our Centre for Global Indigeneity, we do attract interest from Indigenous peoples around the world, and it actually adds a really interesting perspective to the research. And right at the end of this presentation, I'll probably touch briefly on why that's important here as well. But essentially, the findings were based on Australian Indigenous peoples' experiences. One of the participants noted that there's a perception in the Indigenous community that social media terrain is fraught with risk and is often an unsafe space for a lot of people. So the idea of this report is that the findings will hopefully inform future focused strategies for governments and for social media organisations. And I'm quite happy to share that I've been told by members of Facebook that the report findings that I'm talking about today have actually been used in internal discussions and approaches to content policy and to how they kind of operate as an organisation as well. Myself and colleagues at the department also continue to work with Facebook in terms of sitting on advisory boards and engaging in other sorts of research as well. So it's a nice kind of industry partnership that's emerged and working reasonably well at the moment. A little bit about Indigenous peoples and social media generally. I think this sentence probably prefaces almost everything I've written about social media, and essentially it's comes from the work of Professor Bronwyn Carlson and Dr. Ryan Fraser, and some of the research that people around or in Bronwyn and Ryan's networks and my own networks have pretty much realised that Indigenous peoples are avid users of social media, and some statistics indicate that on a per capita basis, Indigenous people actually use social media more than non-Indigenous people in communities. The research I conducted suggested, not unsurprisingly, that Facebook and Twitter are essentially the front runners in terms of the most popular platforms for Indigenous peoples to use, to gather on, to be part of, and that they actually serve two different kind of purposes, I guess, in a sense. Facebook and Instagram, I tend to talk about as the same, well, not really the same thing, but together, because Instagram, as many of you will know, is owned by Facebook, to be more family focused, community focused, sharing stories and ideas that are aimed at kind of building community. And so there are a lot of Facebook pages that share things like community events, certainly political activism, mobilisation, and that sort of thing, as well as ways just to connect with people when you're not living on country, or you've got family in other places because of study, work, whatever. Twitter is, again, as many of you might know, a lot more, I guess, for want of a better term, politically engaged. Twitter's where a lot of participants observed a lot more political action, a lot more kind of assertiveness and oftentimes aggression, really engaged kind of commentary on the state of politics and policy in this country. So they serve slightly different purposes there. I noted TikTok in some of the focus groups, and we discussed that, and a lot of people who discussed TikTok said that it was new, that they really they knew what it was about. They had observed, they had watched TikTok videos, but they hadn't really self-published in that space very frequently, if at all. I suspect that's going to change. I suspect that, TikTok is probably, I think it's about 5 or 6 years old now. I think TikTok came out in about 2016 originally. But Facebook and Instagram have certainly followed suit with the whole shift towards short video services. So Facebook Live is now a thing. Instagram has recently announced that they're sort of pushing towards more video content as opposed to static imagery. So, it's not worth thinking about short video services as specifically TikTok, but, essentially they're going to be it is the next wave of kind of digital technology and communication in this space. Look, a few stats here. Nearly 100% of respondents said they access some form of social media. They were things like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Some people mentioned academia, LinkedIn, and those sorts of spaces. 62% said they use social media on a daily basis, which I thought was potentially a little low, particularly given that the target audience were people who were familiar with social media. But people don't necessarily have to use it every day, I guess. Not really much to talk about this number 12.56. That's the approximate hours people suggested they use social media per week. And depending on the literature that you read, you could suggest that people tend to overestimate their use of social media. Other literature would suggest people tend to underestimate it. I think this number is probably best taken as an indication of what most participants thought was a kind of acceptable average amount of time each week, and that probably it differed. I know mine certainly does. So I looked a little bit into, after I sort of established how Indigenous people were using social media, I looked into how community was using social media, or the impact of social media platforms for Indigenous communities more generally. And something that came out of the research, obviously, is that there's the core affordance of social media for community is really to establish and maintain connections between family and community. A brief example is that while I currently live on Kaurna country, I work on Darug country in New South Wales, and up until recent sort of travel restrictions and things, spent a lot of time in New South Wales. I was also a member of Nunga's Community, which is a Kaurna community Facebook page. And it was a really good way for me, working off country, to remain connected to what's going on back here in Kaurna community, in Ngarrindjeri community, and see what my friends and community members are sort of up to, what's going on, and that sort of thing. So that was a real benefit for communities in that sense. Social media is really great for communities and individuals to share stories that are quite often overlooked by mainstream news services. Once upon a time, we sort of had the Courier Mail as an alternative to mainstream print media. Now, there are sort of mainstream outlets for Indigenous news and information sharing, I guess, in terms of NITV, and the ABC is doing a fairly reasonable job in many ways. But social media really allows for self-publication from communities, from organisations, and from individuals to sort of bypass editorial sort of barriers and things that existed. You only have to look at, essentially, examples like the various commercial television networks are still sort of tending not to include a lot of Indigenous content when it is relevant. A huge thing for community social media offers is for activism and political mobilisation. Last year, and actually just before I started this research, Black Lives Matter hit the headlines on mainstream as well as Indigenous media across the globe. And social media, particularly Twitter, presented a really great space for individuals and communities to engage in the narrative that was coming out of Black Lives Matter movements and how it was received in Australia, and really let people know that this was more than just a whole bunch of people rioting in the street. This was about issues that are relevant to African American people in the US and Indigenous people in Australia and around the world, and that police brutality and high incarceration rates were a reality that really needs to be addressed. And so communities could really use social media positively to raise awareness about those sorts of things, and still do. The research was essentially focused on negativity. I did want to sort of look at positivity as well, and I have to an extent already in this presentation, and will after we get to that. But really, the point here was to identify what is negative content, how is it navigated, how is it being named by Indigenous peoples in Australia. We established that it was, it's fairly positive that Facebook, Twitter, and Google and other organisations are visibly working towards identifying negative content on their platforms. I can't speak on behalf of Twitter or Google. I can't really speak on behalf of Facebook either, but I can at least say from my experience there has been some movement. I mean, funding this research was one step, and they're kind of doing some other things in Facebook to kind of identify how negative content plays out. One of the biggest problems that any organisation sort of faces, any non-Indigenous organisation faces, is that negative content is often culturally nuanced when it's occurring in Indigenous communities, or when Indigenous people are interpreting it or navigating it, experiencing it. So it's really difficult for even really high-tech organizations to deploy things like algorithms and AI, live moderators, etc., to pick up on the cultural nuances of negativity and be able to respond accordingly. It's really difficult for a non-Indigenous person without any kind of idea, essentially, to realize and to understand what the impact of certain language can be, what the impact of sharing certain images can be, and all of those quite subtle sort of ways that negativity can be interpreted by Indigenous people. One of the examples of that, one of the first examples was that I asked participants to talk to me about what cyberbullying was and if they had experienced it. And the general idea that I got was that the term was essentially kind of outdated, mostly because they weren't sure what cyberbullying meant anymore. I got the impression from some of the older participants that cyberbullying was sort of linked quite closely to older styles of pre-web 2.0 sort of communication online. So I'm talking about internet relay chat and bulletin boards and that sort of thing. Since then, the way we access this stuff through mobile devices, the types of content that we can share and the ways that we can share it, the speed at which we can share it has changed dramatically. And so I think a lot of participants were a bit, didn't think the term cyberbullying fit. I think the biggest problem with that word actually is the prefix cyber is quite outdated. You could think about, maybe, some people have written, some literature suggests that maybe we start thinking about it as cyber aggression, cyber harassment. Again, I don't think the prefix is perhaps appropriate, but, there are a lot of people working on that, including colleagues of mine, I know. One of the participants suggested that they're not sure if lateral violence is included in cyberbullying. And I think this just showed, that the idea of, or the definition of cyberbullying was a bit hazy. And I'll talk a little bit about lateral violence in a second. We'll just go for some stats because everyone loves stats. We're all sociologists, right? Look, the stats were interesting and sometimes troubling. I think on this page, you're free to have a quick look at them. I think the 35% in the top right-hand corner is a little bit odd. I'm not sure how that kind of got in there. But look, 97% of respondents suggested they encountered negative content at least every week. 62% said they encountered it on a daily basis. 81 said they had reported negative content to moderators, and nearly half said they reported it more than 5 times, which is kind of disturbing. I think one of the most disturbing things here was that nearly 80% of respondents said that they've witnessed hate speech at least weekly over the last 6 months, which seems incredibly high and essentially, suggests we obviously need to be doing more about identifying what counts as hate speech and how do we address it. So yeah, that was quite disturbing. There were 3 kind of themes or ideas, I guess, that emerged in terms of what participants identified as negative content on social media. The first one was threats of violence against individuals. And this really kind of countered a bit of an old idea that, what happens online stays online. That, you could just switch it off and it wouldn't matter anymore, It's not the case anymore, particularly now that, people are taking their mobile devices into their bedrooms, into their safe places at home. They're using them for work, for school, to order food, to travel around town when we're allowed to travel. They're in our lives and they're there. So threats of violence against individuals on social media, on devices becomes really pervasive in your life. People suggested that these sorts of comments were awful, disgusting, deliberately intended to hurt people, and that there were few ramifications for people that were being racist, bullying, or inappropriate on online. That, I think, speaks to a bit of a kind of, I don't know, well-known point, I guess, that that anonymity and pseudonymity on online spaces or in social media has for a long time been kind of cited as one of the reasons, one of the factors behind such serious aggression on well, through digital technology. The idea that you could hide behind an avatar or a pseudonym, or you could hide behind a computer screen or keyboard and unleash this really vile rhetoric. So it's still kind of happening. There's still this idea that there are few consequences for engaging in this sort of stuff, which actually, you know, makes us need to think, well, we obviously then need to think about how do we address it? If there aren't consequences immediately, how do we address all this negativity that's happening and sort of encourage people to remove it or make it less possible to kind of post? Again, another disturbing thing that was raised in terms of threats of violence against individuals is that sometimes it didn't just stay online. Sometimes these threats actually resulted in physical violence against individuals, and that the online spaces, online platforms and products were actually then utilized to broadcast or stream this physical violence back into the online space and essentially create this horrible kind of circle of bullying and harassment that results in physical violence and aggressions. The second trope or idea that people noticed on social media in terms of negative content was racism and white supremacy. And there was suggestions that this was increasing lately. Someone suggested that they think they had seen a surge in people putting the emoticon of a monkey and things like that on people's comments. This certainly, participants suggested that this surge in this sort of racist attack happened, you know, or tends to happen when this idea gets raised in the media. It certainly happened after Adam Goodes was racially vilified, not only on the playing field by a young woman, but by the president of the Collingwood Football Club on radio no fewer than a few days later. These sorts of comments get picked up by people online where perhaps there are fewer consequences and then get levelled again and again at Indigenous people. The other thing which sort of speaks a little bit to white supremacy as well as racism is that participants noted a really staunch defence of colonial ideology on social media. So sometimes it wasn't just kind of really overt stuff like putting a monkey emoticon or using racist and vile language. It was the kind of the reification, the use of language that reinforces colonial ideology. So the language of that delegitimizes Indigenous identity, that delegitimizes Indigenous people's connections to country and sovereignty, that speaks back to things like you know, blood quantum and you know, half caste, quarter caste, quadroon, that sort of thing. Again, participants suggested that all this stuff that's occurring online tended to kind of reflect what they were also seeing in mainstream media. I'm sure you all kind of expect that. You know, some participants mentioned certain media commentators like Pauline Hanson and Andrew Bolt and Mark Latham that tend to kind of draw on or double down on that colonial ideology of illegitimate Indigenous identity and incivility and inferiority and all of those sorts of concepts and ideas. That, you know, people pick those up from mainstream media and then re-attack or relaunch them on social media. So there's a big link there that I think is worthy of further investigation. Following on from that, in a sense, the third idea that people raised were was challenges to Indigenous identity and lateral violence. So challenges to Indigenous identity or legitimacy of Indigenous identity, according to Atwood and many others, emerges from colonial strategies to undermine the legitimacy of Indigenous peoples' connection and custodianship of land. I've kind of just mentioned or just talked about how that kind of works, but essentially, talking about Indigenous peoples as prehistoric, as pre-modern, as uncivilized, and this language was picked up by politicians, by media commentators, in all sorts of ways over the last however many years, decades, to basically position Indigenous peoples as not really having a legitimate claim to sovereignty based on the idea that we weren't really civilized or modern, and we weren't really suited and still aren't really suited to handling life in the modern world. That sort of language keeps getting reused and regurgitated on social media. It seems to be a go-to for a lot of people in these discussions. Really disturbing is the lateral violence that occurs in social media. And the lateral violence quite often relies on those same tropes, those same ideas of, whether or not an individual is legitimately Indigenous. Lateral violence, according to Bailey, and again, heaps of others, suggests that, or means that, refers to behaviours which are damaging in nature to both the party performing the behaviours as well as to those they are directed towards. So questioning the legitimacy of another Indigenous person, questioning their connection to culture, has the effect of marginalising or oppressing or vilifying them, but also it has the same effect on your own identity and your own culture. It's tearing everything down from the inside, lateral violence, sometimes called horizontal violence. So there's some ways that this looks that someone sort of suggested was that there's a lot of shaming online for people who didn't grow up in culture or with culture, people who don't live on country, people who don't exhibit close connections to what we believe is legitimately Indigenous. And so other Indigenous people might be sort of pushing others out. It's a really tricky and really nasty sight. And it really comes from colonial ideology. It's a colonial tactic to kind of set Indigenous people or marginalised people against each other in terms of questioning their identity and their legitimacy to even exist, so that it doesn't really have to happen from the top down then. Insidious. So on that note, let's turn to some positive stuff. Happily, 83% of participants said that they encountered positive content daily, and everybody said that they encountered positivity or saw positivity at least weekly. And some of the positivity that they mentioned were things like funny memes that they would share or that friends had shared. I might just note that memes can be both ways. Memes can be positive, can be funny, can be a good way to kind of have a laugh with friends. Memes are often deployed as really horrible, violent forms of racism as well. So that's certainly something to look out for there. Look, positive stories of Indigenous people and their achievements. I noticed a whole lot of great stuff about Patty Mills being named as a flag bearer the other day. A friend of mine who's Torres Strait Islander, her father was a quite famous Australian basketballer, and she's posting this wonderful stuff about the legacy that Patty Mills signals or is a part of Indigenous Australians and sport. So these sorts of stories are really, really great. They're really uplifting and motivating for a lot of people. Links to fundraising are quite often seen by participants as positive aspects of social media, raising funds to support communities. And I wondered about this, sharing cultural skills and knowledges. Certainly sharing knowledges is a wonderful aspect of social media, but some people in this one particular focus group talked about how they were reaching out and learning about cooking in traditional ways, about weaving, about all sorts of cultural skills. And I think it was because, in part at least, because we had just kind of entered Australia's first kind of lockdown. It was not long after COVID had first sort of hit, and we were all really being asked to stay home as much as possible. And I think a lot of people really used social media to go and learn a little bit about culture and background and community, and learn these amazing things. Learn how to weave via Zoom, which was really interesting. Another one in terms of positivity. Sorry, there are two aspects of positivity that were talked about in terms of overall themes. Positive counter narratives was the first one. And this is a recognised strategy of Facebook. In discussions I've had with members of Facebook's sort of policy and content management team, they've mentioned that they're quite interested in how counter narratives, something that runs counter to all the negativity that's online, can be promoted and can kind of overpower or outnumber the amount of negative content on social media. One of the participants suggested that actually a lot of us are counteracting negativity by posting personal stories and circulating stories about people who are doing really good. One of them that pops into my mind from basically as soon as you start thinking about counter narratives was the hashtag Indigenous Dads that was started by Joel Bayliss in response to Bill Leak. I'm sure all of my colleagues here are going, yep, cool, we know about this because we've talked about this, and it is a really great example of Indigenous dads who were publicly attacked and shamed by a racist cartoonist and racist cartoon that depicted Indigenous fathers as drunken deadbeat dads. This hashtag was a way for Indigenous people in general, as well as Indigenous dads specifically, to show that actually, no, hang on, like you're playing with this horrible racist stereotype, and that look at all the wonderful things that Indigenous fathers are doing for community and for individuals as well. So it was a really great way to share a counter narrative that essentially for me and for other Indigenous people drowned out that horrible commentary that was sparked by Bill Leak's cartoon, because there was a hell of a lot of negativity that was ignited by posting something like that. The other word that featured heavily in all of the transcripts of the focus groups and the interviews in terms of positivity was empowerment. Now, Therese Petray, who is a member of TASA as well, mentioned some time ago, or wrote some time ago, that Web 2.0, the kind of self-publishing interactive web, has the potential to democratize and decentralize large social movements, and that these interactive media support the empowerment of Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. I think I quickly just want to take a point to suggest that when we think about the potential of Web 2.0 or the internet or digital media to democratize and decentralize, it's worth just stopping and thinking that doesn't actually, I don't think we can say that equates to emancipatory outcomes for this sort of thing. There was a suggestion years ago that the internet somehow would be some emancipatory technology that would supersede any sort of social inequality, which is just rubbish. It doesn't. And I wish I could remember their name. Actually, you know what? I'll show you the book right here because it's right here. Sophia Noble wrote this book, Algorithms of Oppression, a few years ago. And what this book suggested was that, no, the internet hasn't been emancipatory. It hasn't broken down these kind of social inequalities or structures of inequality. In fact, it's essentially reified them. Algorithms and search engines and platforms and programs are essentially designed by people who have privilege in our society, and they reflect that. When search engines are used, the suggested search terms tend to follow, based on the algorithm, tend to follow the search terms that were used by the majority, not the minority. And so quite often, even a search engine can be an incredibly racist kind of experience, incredibly negative experience for a lot of people, not just Indigenous people. I would totally recommend that book, by the way, Algorithms of Oppression. Anyway, having said that, Teresa Pedret does actually have a point, that there are opportunities for Indigenous people to use interactive social media, digital media, technology to empower ourselves and our communities. Participants suggested that, one of the participants said, and I quote, "All of us sisters are coming together and, we're actually motivating each other." And I think, again, this was in response a little bit to the sort of lockdown, or the lockdown 1.0, if you want, the Clayton's lockdown at the start, that people were sort of like, okay, we need to reach out to community here and stay strong during uncertain times. And this participant in particular noted that, it was a really great way for people to kind of get together, to share successes, to support each other in the face of adversity, and really empower each other to succeed. So I had two core recommendations that came from this research. The first was that social media platforms or organisations must continue to evaluate new and emerging definitions and mechanisms of harmful and hate speech on their platforms. So it's not something that's going to, we can't just say, yes, we've identified it, let's move on, that's great, we won't do that in future, because every day new technologies are advancing and developing. Every day something's happening in the world that gets reflected on social media, and the discussion about that evolves as well. And we really need to keep our fingers on that button, or that pulse, as it were. The second recommendation was that disintermediated social media spaces, so essentially spaces that allow self-publication without these editorial barriers, etc., require a global approach to identifying and combating Indigenous people's negative experiences of social media. And just briefly, it wasn't that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that the Standing Rock Sioux tribe got together in protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline and shared their message on social media. And that spread across the world, and Indigenous peoples from all over the globe actually mobilized, got on aircraft and flew over and stood in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in that protest. And I think while that sort of thing is happening, while we're developing a global Indigenous community, it's going to be crucial for platforms and organizations, for governments, for communities to really take a global approach to what looks like negative and positive content and the affordances of social media for Indigenous people. So on that note, I will share briefly some contact details, but I'll send them through to Roger to put on the YouTube site as well. And thanks very much to everybody for listening to my presentation today.
Thank you so much, Tristan, and I will hand it over. Bronwyn's clapping, Tataya, a few others are clapping. Are there any questions forthcoming?
I don't know if Tris wants to share the link to their report that they did, which covers some of this material. That might be nice if you put that in the chat for everyone, Tris.
Oh yeah, I could do that. We're going to put it on the YouTube thing as well, but I'll try and search for that while people are asking questions, because that's a good idea. I might just have to stop sharing my screen.
I wondered if you had any feedback from Facebook, because I knew that they took the report and were using it in their training. Has there been any impact in the way in which they are developing policy or practices within the organisation that you know of?
Not that I know of. I mean, I know that they've been using the report to share amongst themselves to kind of educate staff and colleagues essentially about what's going on and about the findings of the report. They are seemingly quite happy to continue a relationship between myself and them and the department, the Centre for Global Indigenous Studies, the Centre for Global Indigeneity, and you know, going forward to really kind of contribute to their efforts. I'm on a combating hate speech advisory group for Facebook. I know my colleagues Bronwyn and Maddie are on another advisory group for that as well. So I mean, it looks like they're moving with this stuff. They haven't just sort of funded the research and then sort of stopped. So that for me is a positive. I'm not sure how they're going to use the findings and other sorts of stuff in terms of maybe increasing Indigenous employment in their organisation. There's certainly been discussions in Facebook. I mean, that they employ thousands of people to be moderators of their content, who are constantly working every single hour of the day. And as far as I'm aware, they don't yet have an Indigenous Australian person working in that space. And I think that's something they need to work on. And they've certainly been involved in that discussion.
Can I just ask, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And it was differently interesting than both talking to you about it and also reading the piece. I guess one of the questions is also about with Facebook, this idea that they're interested in responding in a way that I guess supports positively charged counter narratives. How are you imagining that they would do that out of this research? You know, I'm just wondering. So I suppose that's also asking how they're going to respond to it. But do they see that that's part of their role, or do they see something happening in the background?
My impression is that they see it as part of their role as an organisation to make connections with members of our community who are doing really positive stuff quite vocally. They're aware of some of the bigger names in the Indigenous community who have a Facebook presence and are quite vocal. They're aware of the kind of negativity that exists there as well, and they're sort of trying to focus their efforts on supporting those who are really pushing some of these ideas that we've identified in this report around positivity on their platform, and maybe working to try and, you know, separately, I think, to try and shift the focus away from the negativity. I don't think it's something they're looking at in terms of AI just yet. I expect that's probably a big hope of theirs, that they could somehow train and program some AI to be able to sort of do that. Personally, I haven't thought about it too much. My initial thoughts are that it would be quite difficult to identify positive counter narratives, pardon me, as they emerge over time, and somehow sort of shift people's attention to them. But, you know, anything's possible, I guess. Sorry.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And I guess, you know, I'm interested in the sort of intersection of gender and sexuality and indigeneity. And one of the things that Facebook's been completely terrible at, but so have the other social media platforms, is moderating discussion around that. So that I guess what I mean by that, I'm just going to be blunt about it because it's based on a number of events that have happened personally to me, but also that I've witnessed for others, is when Indigenous people are being transphobic, they give them a free pass because they see it within the confines of talking about indigeneity. You know, so it's complete free pass, whereas in other contexts it wouldn't be. You know, so it's kind of like not seeing the multiplicity of identity and seeing that as confounding for them. You know, just too difficult for them to kind of comprehend. And obviously part of what you're saying is you look at people who are kind of champions across that space, and they're more likely to be aware of that. But I don't know if Facebook is capable of being able to look at that complexity, which is why I think work like yours matters, because it can highlight complexity, not just the idea of Indigenous community as everything, as everyone, but that greater complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it absolutely has to be noted that this research has its limitations, and the limitations are there for a reason. I'm not going to go and investigate trans experiences, queer experiences, LGBT experiences, and cast any judgment or pass any information on about that. It's absolutely not my place to do it. However, it is my place to recognise that there's a need for that to be done, and I have been happy to see members of the trans and queer communities being involved in some discussions. I'm interested to see how that evolves and emerges, because you're right. I know and I know that it absolutely is not a safe space for people from those communities as well.
Harry's got a question for you, Tristan.
Yes, hi.
Hi, Harry.
Hi, Tristan. Hi, how are you going? Look, thank you very much. My apologies, I was booted off. Look, I just blamed the NBN for it, of course. so I sort of missed the sort of middle part of your presentation. But I had to think about the concept of cyberbullying. And you were saying at the beginning that young people often don't know what you mean by cyberbullying. It's kind of outdated concept. And then I thought, look, the concept of disrespect, for instance, has a long history in critical social theory, but it also resonates with common understandings as well. So I'm just sort of wondering whether, just purely from a conceptual theoretical point of view, whether disrespect would be a useful concept to be using.
What respect is that? Sorry, Harry.
Disrespect.
Disrespect.
Simply because there's a long kind of sort of history in critical social theory that talks about that particular concept.
Yeah, that I guess disrespect could be a line to go down. I think we have to go somewhere other than cyberbullying. Incivility was another one that sort of come up. I think maybe that's problematic in this space right now. But look, I haven't followed the theoretical or conceptual line down ideas around disrespect. I'll be interested to have a look at it. I think my initial thoughts are that it sounds like it would be a fruitful avenue to pursue. Certainly because I do think we need to avoid the kind of outdated cyber prefix in the term. I think bullying is also, even by itself, probably not as useful, and really I guess disrespect probably doesn't refer specifically to a kind of ongoing and repeated set of acts that continually kind of harass and harass individuals that cyberbullying kind of referred to. And I think in that sense disrespect might be useful, because it doesn't necessarily have to be an ongoing repeated set of acts or aggressions for negative content to happen. It could be one person doing it and someone else doing it. So are you being cyberbullied by 50 people, or are you being disrespected in general by 50 people because of some underlying racist or negative kind of sentiment there? Does that make sense?
Yes, look, it makes perfect sense. And, not only because we're at the same uni, but I think we could just have a little chat anyway one of these days. There's a literature on indecency and decency, as I mentioned, incivility and disrespect and misrecognition. So I'm very happy to have a chat with you about that.
That'd be great. I'd like that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think there's also some really interesting stuff on notions of respect that make it somewhat problematic in the context of Indigenous people. That's worth interrogating within just the use of a word like that. I can tell you that the kind of violent emails that I've received from Aboriginal community has been about me being a bit disrespectful. So that's the problem with respect, is that it's entirely contextual. And so the idea of respect is pretty problematic in that way as well. And I think that can only be kind of played out by seeing the difficulty of using a word like respect that has been about the colonial project. It's about managing the colonial project, you know, so obviously it's going to be about what, and it's why I think you align it, Tris, just like you just did then, with that idea of, you know, of civility. Because I think, you know, the civil, I don't think it's a mistake that becomes a part of that, because it's in whose eyes. And then, of course, it's the platform and it's the rest of the community.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point about respect. I mean, I get emails, hateful, racist emails from people that say, with all due respect, I respectfully telling you, and the amount of times that Indigenous people have had to constantly respond to, you know, just in our own units and across campus, to people referring to us in inappropriate ways, like Aborigine, for example, and other terminology. And so we say respectfully, this is how this should play out. And we are disrespectfully replied to as the same thing over and over again. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation, this idea of respect, because some people have it, some people get it. Some people are constantly denied it. And I think we can't underestimate the kind of ideas around racism, how that sits alongside this kind of notion of respect, because people who are inherently racist, who inherently are disrespectful to Indigenous people, will never hear the ways in which they can be respectful.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well said. I don't have anything to add to what Bronwyn just said. I think that's spot on. And Sandy as well. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much for those interactions. Any other questions or comments?
I would just like to ask Tris, so given that we focus quite a lot on Indigenous features in our department and of course in the research that we do, so what are some of your ideas around what is the future of these online spaces? What could happen that would make them a more safer space for Indigenous people, but also a place where we thrive? So is there potential for that, or is that something that we need to rethink the entire thing? Like, are we pulling the plug on this and thinking of something better, or do you think there's scope?
You know what, the pulling the plug and trying something better just reminded me of Trump's recent tantrum where he got barred from everything and said, "Oh, I'm going to start my own." I don't think. I don't think we need to go and start our own or abandon social media. I think there's enough positivity that's identified. There's enough capability, like right today, for social media to empower and to, you know, basically bring those counter narratives to the fore. I can only imagine that in the future, there's going to be so many more opportunities to do this, to engage, to share. And I think, at least in the maybe like last 10 years or so, I think social media has affected quite a bit of change. I'm loath to say that we're moving in with any great speed, but social media has affected a lot of change in Australia and around the world about how Indigenous people's lives and interactions with governments and policy are being perceived by non-Indigenous people and by governments and policy makers. So I think in that sense, it's working, I think. I think back to, pre kind of social media days. And for me, the names like Udra Nunakal, Archie Roach, Anita Heiss, all these people who shared stories through publications, through poetry, through music, to an extent, all had to kind of get through that editorial barrier that I was talking about. So that, the record industry, producers or publishers or whatever, being able to self-publish was a huge turning point in Indigenous political activism. being able to get our voices out to the mainstream without having to have someone go, okay, cool, your story is kind of palatable, we'll run with that, was a massive advancement. And, you know, it was text for a little while, it was text and maybe the occasional image. Now it's video. You know, it's going to, the opportunities are going to increase. And I read an article a long time ago where someone said, you know, we've really hit the kind of pinnacle of digital technology, and that was in 2001, and they were just way off. Their expectations or their predictions for the future just missed it completely. And so I'm loath to say, you know, oh, we're going to take short video messaging into the future and it's going to do all this great stuff. Indigenous people, like, you know, you've written about Bronwyn on many occasions, Indigenous people are incredibly innovative and quick to pick up new technologies and deploy them to suit our own means. And I think that bodes well for the future.